Hello, so we are continuing with our series on the anatomy of the sacred in our Introduction to Religious Studies. This is Professor Joseph Holbrook, and today we're going to be talking about Chapter 6 and about sacred scripture and the role of sacred scripture in many of the different world religions. So let us begin. We start out by looking at some of the uses of scripture. One of the primary uses for sacred scripture is instruction and education. In Judaism, Islam, and Buddhism, there is a special class of scribes, exegetes, interpreters, teachers that emerged. The Jewish rabbis, the Muslim ulam, which means the learned, or fuqaha, which means the men of insight, jurists, and there's also the monks of the Theravada Buddhist Sangha, or community. As in Christianity, these experts in scriptural exegesis or interpretation or hermeneutics often establish schools for teaching youth and the laity. Another use for scripture is public worship and ritual. In Hinduism, the laws of Manu require that a male Brahmin must recite certain verses from the Veda, preceded by the holy syllable Om. In the Roman Catholic Mass, the rehearsal of the sacred word is instrumental in effecting a real change in the condition of the participants in the ritual. Christian worship also uses sermon texts, the lectionary of daily scriptural readings, musical settings for the singing of the Psalms, and the communal recitation of the Lord's Prayer. A third use for scripture is meditation and devotion. In Islam, Sufi mystics visualize certain words from the Qu'ran, or they may repeat certain scriptural passages as a means of achieving a rapturous, mystical union with God. Also true in the monastic life within Christianity and Buddhism. Reading, memorization, and meditation of sacred scripture are taught as a means of accessing the divine. A fourth use of scripture is as an object of religious devotion. In the Sikh religion and its devotional veneration of its canonical scripture, the Guru Granth Sahib, also referred to as the Adi Granth. This holy book is called Guru, for the Sikhs teach that when the succession of the 10 living gurus in the line of the poet Guru Nanak ended, their revered teachings became resident in the book, which became the Guru, or the source of the revealed word. Another final purpose is magical. In Buddhism, the healing of a sutra chanted the hearing of a chanted sutra can convey spiritual power. In Islam, the final 2 surahs, Surah 113 and 114 of the Quran, that deliver from evil, consist of charms or talismanic recitations that are meant to ward off witchcraft and black magic. Some Jews also affix to their doorpost a mezuzah, a small cylinder containing passages from the books of Moses, for similar purposes. So some of the distinctive features of sacred scripture, beginning with logos and wisdom. In Orthodox Judaism, the written Torah is not only a repository of divine law that is to be studied, commented on, and taught by the rabbis with assistance from a long oral tradition. The Torah is also the eternal divine wisdom, an uncreated aspect or plan of God that is manifest before the creation of the world. The Jewish philosopher Philo took the Greek concept of logos and identified it with the passage on wisdom, which tends to personify wisdom in Proverbs 8:27. When he, that is God, established the heavens, I, wisdom, was there. When he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I, wisdom, was beside him as an artisan. And so Philo identified this person that personifies wisdom, who was with God from the beginnings, as the Greek logos, or rational principle. Also in the Christian Bible, in the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic and Anglican churches, the Bible is revered in worship. I've also seen this in the Lutheran church that I go to. The Bible is often carried to the center of the sanctuary among the congregation and by an altar boy, and is held high before the priest in a solemn procession before the reading of one of the Gospels. In some Protestant churches, especially in Pentecostalism, the Bible is often treated as if it were possessing miraculous power, that is, the book itself. Another characteristic of the sacred writ is its normative authority and canonicity. The English word canon comes from a Greek word, canon, which refers to a measuring rod or a rule. So its canonicity refers to its authoritiveness. There's also the Qu'ran in Islam. The Quran simply means the book in Arabic and is not a collection of books. The Quran consists of 114 chapters, also known as surahs. The ordering of the surahs and the editorial work was carried out by Muhammad's disciples. The text of the Quran was essentially settled within 23 years of the Prophet's death. The need for interpretation of the Quran's meaning led to the Hadith, which developed over the couple centuries after the death of Muhammad. In time, it too, the Hadith, became authoritative and normative. The Hebrew literature is unique for being written over a 1500-year period. It's King Josiah in the 7th century BC discovered a hidden book of the law, probably Deuteronomy, and led a revival of biblical studies. The Torah is considered to be the first 5 books of Moses, also known as the Pentateuch, which was completed about 400 BC. The prophets were considered divinely inspired by 200 BCE. The writings includes the Psalms, the wisdom literature, Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, and Nehemiah, which became sacred literature for the Jews by the 2nd century of the Common Era, or AD. However, many Orthodox Jews do not accept the prophets or their writings as part of the Torah and the same level of authority. Now, the interpretation of Scripture. The discipline of interpretation is known as hermeneutics. It is the inquiry concerned with the presuppositions and rules of interpretation. Scripture is written and passed on in the human language, and language, being human, is always embedded in a specific cultural context, a context that conveys particular meanings and culture-specific ideas or presuppositions. The reader of a text should be familiar with the language and the grammar, but also the cultural and historical context, in order to understand the writer's original meaning and intention. This is a picture of the Wesleyan quadrilateral, which is the idea that interpretation should be a 4-legged stool, and that one should not only use Scripture to interpret Scripture itself, but one must also go to the tradition and see what has been the traditional interpretation, and one must also use one's own experience and reason. And these 4 things, reason, experience, tradition, and Scripture, are the 4 legs that hold up the stool of hermeneutics or interpretation. Buddhists also have hermeneutics and interpretation. None of the other world's religions possesses such an overwhelming body of sacred writings as does Buddhism. Buddhism was the world's earliest missionary religion. During its 2,500 years of existence, it has traveled from its home in India to Sri Lanka, to Tibet in Central Asia, to China, Korea, Japan, and southeast into Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Buddhism is the oldest missionary religion in the world. There is a map that shows the spread of Buddhism over a 1,000-year period. So we'll play that very quickly. You see that Buddhism began in northeastern India and spread throughout India. It later died out in India. It was unable to compete with Hinduism. But then up into Central Asia, through Tibet along the Silk Road, and into China was the early stages of the spread of Buddhism, and then also from India into Burma, Cambodia, eventually to Japan, and into Indonesia. So you see how Buddhism has spread. Christianity and Buddhism are the two great, and Islam are the three great missionary religions. So continuing on with our presentation, Christian biblical interpretation that began in the early period after the death of Christ within the first generation. The canon of the New Testament was closed by the 4th century of the Common Era, as the Christian community regarded the New Testament as the fulfillment of the Old Testament and as foreshadowing and the preparation and the coming of Christ. And the Christian community interpreted doctrinal conflicts such as those between Paul and James, which created a certain amount of tension. The four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were all in common use by 120 A.D., and the earliest letters of the New Testament that were written were those letters of St. Paul to the churches. Particularly, it's thought that the letter to Galatians was the very first letter of the New Testament that was available. There's a pervasive role of Scripture in Confucianism. Confucianism has a book called the I Ching, which are the classics of the Scriptures, and the Shu, or the sacred books. During the Han Dynasty, which is around 200 BC through 220 AD, the Emperor Han Wu Chi established the 5 classics as essential. These include the I Ching, the Book of Changes, the Book of Poetry, the Book of History, the Book of Rites, and the Spring and Autumn Annals. There was a Neo-Confucian revival in the Sung Dynasty around 1000 AD, which brought to prominence the 4 books, the Analects and Mencius. In Hinduism, the oldest Sanskrit text is the Rig Veda, which was not printed until 1854. The Rig Veda is 10 books of over 1,000 hymns to various Hindu deities. There's also the Sama Veda, the Yajur Veda, and the Arthava Veda. The Shruti is what is heard or transmitted orally. The Smriti is what is remembered. The Upanishads are philosophical treatises written around the 8th century BCE, before the Common Era. About 100 CE, or AD, the Shruti literature had come to be regarded as the eternal word. In content and form was believed to be not composed by any human. Then there's a sacred literature in Hinduism that is more commonly known among Hindus than even the Vedas or the Upanishads. Millions of Hindus are unfamiliar with the classic Vedic literature, but their religious imaginations are steeped in the stories and the polytheistic myths of the popular Indian epics, the Puranas, written from about 400 to 200 BC, also known as the ancient lore. The 2 great popular epics are the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. The Mahabharata is the longest epic poem in the world, and many times is described as the longest poem ever written. Its longest version consists of over 200,000 individual verse lines, containing about 1.8 million words in total. The Mahabharata is roughly 10 times the length of the Iliad and the Odyssey put together. The Ramayana depicts the duties of relationships, portraying the ideal characters like the ideal father, the ideal servant, the ideal king. The name Ramayana is a compound of Rama and Ayana, which means going and advancing, and is translated as Rama's journey. So, in conclusion, the Hindu Vedas are recited and transmitted only in Sanskrit. The Qu'ran is only to be recited and transmitted in Arabic, similar to the Hebrew Bible, which is supposed to only be studied in Hebrew. Islam distinguishes between the Quran and the Hadith, as does Judaism between the Torah, the written and the oral Torah, or the Talmud. There are recent interpretations that in Christianity that we don't have time to get into with liberation theology, progressive Christianity, and Christian feminism, but we'll have to go over those in class. Thank you for your time and attention.